What does the Hulk and a tiny woman fighting off a polar bear have in common? You'd be surprised. Welcome to Truly Terrified, Paranormal versus Physics, where we talk about some really weird stuff, and Joe the scientist explains how it's not possible, or maybe it is. I'm Lynn, and...
I'm Joe.
Okay, so when he was coming up with an idea for a new comic, artist Jack Kirby witnessed a woman lift a car to get her child out from underneath it. The moment helped inspire one of his most famous creations, the Incredible Hulk. So this is what happened. No judgment here. The woman's baby was caught under the running board of this car. The kid was playing in the gutter, which is weird. And so he was crawling into the gutter from the sidewalk, and he went under the car. The mother was horrified. So it sounds like maybe she was in the car because she looked out the rear window.
Well, how would it
But
be
the car,
moving?
if the car wasn't moving, what is the big...
How'd the kid get under the thing?
He was playing in the gutter and he crawled under the car.
Yeah, but the car's not on him then.
I know, it just seems weird.
That seemed weird.
But anyway, she got out of the car and she lifted it up the rear end of it. And so Kirby didn't say if the car was moving or what the deal actually was. It just sounds like the baby crawled into the parked car, so it's not really a very dangerous situation. But it impressed him that she lifted the car, and that inspired him to create the Incredible Hulk. So we've all heard the stories of a mom under an emergency situation lifting a car off of her baby like that, or something similar. I know I have. And it actually has a name for this phenomenon. It's called hysterical strength.
So it's like a very emotional situation, hysterical,
yes,
and then they get a burst of strength.
Yes. Most of the stories about it are, they're under emergency circumstances, and they involve a car. Maybe because a car is like probably the heaviest thing you're ever going to know.
Uh-huh.
But I did find a few that did not, and here is one. I cannot pronounce these names. I believe they're probably Inuit names.
Mm-hmm.
In 2006 in Ivujikvik, Quebec, I don't know if I'm saying that right, a lady named Lydia, I'm not even going to attempt her last name. She was just a little petite woman, and she displayed remarkable courage and strength when she confronted a polar bear that posed a threat to her son and his friends while they were playing hockey near the local youth center. Lydia was about 41 at the time, just a little lady, and she lived near the local youth center. She was outside with her two younger children when she noticed the polar bear eyeing the boys. Okay, can we just say, noticed a polar bear? That's like, oh, I'm just standing here enjoying the sunshine, and there's a polar bear. Oh, I noticed it. I don't know.
I mean, they do. Imagine this. You're in the woods and you notice a black bear. It's like, oh, you saw this black shape, but then it was like a moment where you're like, oh, I know what that is.
You recognize it. Okay, so the word notice, though, in my mind, there's a connotation of casualness.
Oh, yeah, I see what you're saying.
And I would not be casual. First of all, I wouldn't be casual anywhere where there is the risk of a polar bear wandering into a town near a youth center. So anyway, she sees this polar bear and she doesn't even hesitate. She just runs towards the animal, solely focused on protecting her 7-year-old son from harm. So he must have been closer than the other one. Another woman who was on her way to work saw this, and she saw Lydia struggling with the bear. Do you know how big a polar bear is? It's gigantic. Struggling, that means that in some way she did have some kind of strength behind her to be able to struggle with it, because otherwise a polar bear would just go one swipe of his huge paw with giant claws, would just, you'd be dead. So she informed the police, and she was screaming, polar bear, and a child ran to get help, and there was a man named, I think, Analik, which is an unfortunate...
Oh my God, you're right.
He retrieved a rifle from a sled, because remember, it sounds like it's in an Inuit village in Quebec, like very north. So he gets this rifle, he runs back, and he fired 3 warning shots into the air. Despite this, the bear continued, as he described it, an altercation with Lydia. this petite 41-year-old mother. An altercation implies there's equal fight value, you know. The bear ignored those shots, and so Anelik was looking at the bear, and the bear looked at him, and he realized the bear was going to start moving towards him. So he shot it 4 times, and it died. He made sure Lydia was safe. He made sure the bear was dead. They took Lydia to the police station to report this. Why they didn't take her to the hospital? They said she was covered in blood, visibly shaken, but uninjured.
So the blood was from the bear, presumably?
I don't know. How could she have made the bear bleed? Do you know how they've got a thick pad of fat?
So
they've got thick
presumably, if you punched its nose and you gave it a nosebleed,
well, maybe
the bleeding nose might then, she was punching its nose.
Okay, so the most remarkable thing about this is that she wasn't killed instantly. She was fighting with the bear long enough for a kid to run for help, for this guy to go get his gun, for, all these things to occur, and she still wasn't dead. And then she didn't die anyway. I think that's really remarkable. And that she just rushed in. I guess that's not as remarkable because parents do that sort of thing.
What I'm getting out of it is, so first of all, you gotta always look what is the range that the truth could be described by the same story? So, for instance, it could have been the most gigantic matriarch bear that you've ever seen, just a hulking behemoth bear. And she is this frail, cannot lift anything person. Or it could be a young bear and the mother is stronger than you would think. Some people are quite strong, even with no visible muscles. And also, it could be that she was physically wrestling with the bear, or she could have been just striking it and it wasn't really putting up a fight. It wasn't grabbing at her. Maybe there was even no contact,
That, yes. So we have to remember that this is being told by the people who were there. The adrenaline's pumping high.
And they could even be embellishing it.
Yeah, they could very well be embellishing it. Okay, so here's another one.
Okay.
This one is a car one. Bob Renning, he was 52 years old at the time, and he was driving with his girlfriend in New Brighton, Minnesota, when he noticed flames under a car that was behind him. He looked in his rearview mirror and he sees this car with flames shooting out from it. The driver of the car, Michael Johannes, I don't know.
Joannis.
Analick.
Yeah.
Oh, that was awful. So this driver of the car, I'll just call him Michael. He seemed completely unaware of the fire. Renning tried to get his attention. The girlfriend was leaning out the window trying to signal Michael, and they honked their horn. Nothing seemed to be working. Michael seemed oblivious to what they were doing, and then he pulled over, must have realized there was a problem. He later told a news station that his car's taillights were flashing on the dashboard, and the brakes didn't work, and all the electronic systems were malfunctioning. So that's why he pulled over. He didn't know the car was on fire. And then the doors locked, and he couldn't open the door. The windows wouldn't go down because they were electronic. So he was trapped inside. Bob Renning stopped his car about 300 feet ahead of this guy, probably because it took him that long to stop. And he called 911 while he was running back to Michael's car. I don't know how, I guess you could call 911. I don't know why his girlfriend didn't just call 911. That seems kind of silly.
Didn't have a phone?
You'd think she would have taken his phone and called 911 while he was running.
If he had it and he started running. You know what I mean?
I guess. So he runs back towards this car, and when he reached it, it was so full of smoke he couldn't even see anybody inside. But at some point he realized that Michael was trying to break the window on the passenger side. So he'd crawled over to the passenger side. He's trying to break the window, and Bob Renning tried to open the door, but he couldn't. And suddenly he got a burst of adrenaline, and he bent the door frame, and when it bent, it shattered the glass, and Michael was able to climb out of the broken window opening and was safe. He had he was sore, he had a few little cuts, but he was totally okay. So Renning, who serves in the Air Force, couldn't explain how he managed to bend the door.
Was the door bent afterward?
Yes.
Is there pictures?
This happened in, it was like 2006 or something. So it's relatively recent. It might even been more recent than that. He says he keeps fit by running a few times a week, but he doesn't go to the gym, nothing like that. It's not like he's a weightlifter. Bending the door. So that was definitely hysterical strength.
So if there's no like people after the fact looked at the door and they said, yeah, it was bent at like 12-degree angle, you know, the glass shattering, if the guy is also hitting the glass and then the other guy is warping the glass by pulling on the door, maybe that's enough to shatter the glass. The glass is meant to shatter when it breaks.
Yes.
So, and they shatter very suddenly. Sometimes, like you could take a rock, a small rock, and just tap it.
That's why those little hammers you're supposed to have in your car.
Yeah, you should have one of the little breakaway hammer things. They also have a cutter for your seatbelt.
Oh,
I mean, I guess some of them probably don't.
Yeah, I think Ron Cornell had one of those.
So as with all of these stories, it's like how fallible are the people who witnessed the event and who are now recollecting the story?
Okay, so the lady in Quebec, I could see that being something that those people reported out of their own emotional high running adrenaline and everything. Okay, so that's true. As for the Hulk guy, the artist that made the Incredible Hulk, I don't know what the emergency was, so I don't really understand that. But let me just say, I looked up, how does this happen? Why does it happen? Is it even really possible? Could these people all be making this up? Could their memory of the situation have been altered because of their heightened emotional state? So there have actually been scientists who've done studies of this. So early tests found that adrenaline makes muscles twitch more, but it doesn't make them contract harder or faster or presumably more efficiently. It's just that they twitch more. So one idea to explain this is a guy named Tim Noak came up with central governor theory. He thinks that the brain controls how many muscle units are active. Normally, not all muscle units are used to save energy and prevent exhaustion, but in emergencies, the brain might let all the units work to help you survive.
That's what I've heard as well. Like, for instance, other primates, they're much stronger than people. This is what I've heard, supposedly because they use just more of their muscle fibers all at once. So they can like rip your arm off because all of their muscle fibers are going. As opposed to humans, which maybe it's an efficiency thing, I don't know, but they supposedly, not all of your muscle fibers. Like, okay, so if you're lifting a heavy weight, I have experience lifting heavy weights.
Yes, you do.
There are certainly points when it's clear you could be doing more. You could be exerting a higher force and lifting a heavier weight than you're currently lifting. You're struggling with this weight, but you can feel something. Obviously, you can do more. And it's frequently the case, at least with me, that on a subsequent day, you can lift less weight. And so there's things like, okay, maybe some muscle fibers are damaged, or I know there's something called, I think they call it mind-muscle connection, or neural muscular efficiency. It represents a good causal mechanism, but I can't see muscle fibers or nerves, so I don't know definitively. But when your brain sends a signal to your muscles, the signal intensity recruits more muscles. I mean, those are the words typically used. Recruits, as in not all your muscle fibers are actually working. There are also fast twitch and slow twitch muscle fibers, which don't all function necessarily at the same time. But you can see that if there is a variability in how many muscle fibers are actually functioning in a given impulse from your brain, that there must be a high end to that. And the high end to that represents presumably all of your muscle fibers going their hardest at once. So clearly it's a neurological thing more than the functionality of your muscles. I mean, possibly it's something to do with like oxygen saturation of your muscle tissue or ambient, like I think it's ATP, energy sources for your muscles in your blood.
Do you know what ATP stands for?
I think it stands for the name of a molecule, so I have no clue. But I believe that's the one of maybe or the chemical used by muscles to contract. I could be totally wrong in that. If your brain sends a signal, recruits all the neurons going to a particular muscle group, and then all of those muscle groups, all of those muscle fibers in that muscle group can go as hard as possible, and they have the energy to do so, the resources, oxygen, energy, chemicals, whatever, then presumably that upper end exerts a significantly higher force than like just typical functionality, especially if the thing about the like apes is true, where like a chimpanzee can rip your arm off.
Yeah.
A person cannot rip another person's arm off typically.
Right.
Even like a huge power lifter can't do that. At least I hope not. And also, I should say this. We know that people like power lifters, like really big guys with a lot of muscle, who have trained their muscles specifically to lift really heavy weights, can do things like lift one end of a car up. They can't like lift the whole car up.
So I read that people who lift heavy weights use more muscle units at a time. They just use more muscle units. So that's what gives them more strength, even if they have the same muscle size as those who lift lighter weights. You know, that would go along with what you're saying, that, you know, lifting up a car would not be that big a deal. But a guy named Robert Girandola, who is an exercise expert, he said that most cars have most of their weight in the front, which makes sense. That's where the motor is. And when someone lifts a car, it's almost always at the rear or the side.
Keep in mind, too, the suspension on a car, the weight of the car, so that's all its contents, the chassis, the you know, everything, is pressing down the suspension. When you exert a force, you are helping the suspension lift that load, but you're not necessarily lifting the car.
That is true. So when somebody says, "Oh, they lifted the car," the tires may never have left the ground.
Yeah.
You know, they just lifted it up enough for somebody to get pulled out.
Exactly. And if you're focused on a person who's stuck under it, they're not under the tire.
You feel the car rise because you're lifting the suspension.
Yeah, and then the person can crawl out because the thing is off them. But they didn't actually lift the car. Now, that could be very impressive. I mean, it's very impressive. I think it's
impressive regardless.
Yeah.
So I read lots of stories about people who lifted tractors off other people. And I can understand why that would be the case. Because if you're in a town and a car is on top of a person, you're probably going to call 911. That's going to be your first response. We're all trained to do it. But if you're out on a farm in the middle of nowhere, I mean, imagine those farms out in Wisconsin, you know, out in the fields, what would you do?
Yeah.
Your dad had a tractor roll over on him, and somehow his father, an obese man, got the tractor off of him so that he didn't die. But the tractor, I don't know if they have the same suspension. You know, I don't know. But they do have giant rear wheels.
Yeah,
which would almost make it like a pivot.
So that's another thing. So imagine this. You have a car that's like a weird clown car that all the weight's very, very high up, like 100 feet in the air. Now imagine pushing that, just pushing it over. You know, you could probably push it over depending how wide the wheelbase is. And the reason for that is you can always flex an object a little bit. And if the center of mass of the object goes over the farthest line, pivot line, so there's a line of points of contact of the object and the ground, and that's the farthest line that if the center of mass goes over that line,
it's going to tip.
Any point over that line, then it's going to tip over. And because a higher object, when the center of mass is farther away from that line, the angle between where it is before you pushing it and after is much smaller. If it was 1,000 feet above, it would still only have to move like 5 feet or whatever up there.
Right.
But all it would have to do down here is change by a minute degree angle, to make the center mass go over that line. So with the tractor stories as well, they might be on, actually in all of them, really, but the ones where it's like flipping over, they might be on an incline. Or I think the tractor itself might be tilted.
I think that's almost always what it is. That the tractor is doing whatever tractors do on an incline, or two wheels drop down into a ditch or something, and then it tips sideways, not front to back or something.
Oh, and that's the other thing. If you can imagine like a car, it tips over, most of the center of mass, let's say, is more towards the wheel. But now that it's tipped over, the wheels are on the side. The center of mass is closer to that pivot point, which is that's where the wheels are. And you have this big old long lever arm then going towards the top of the car, which when you lift, all you have to do is move the center of mass over. That's why people, like, you have two people and a car is flipped over and the two people lift the car up and then get it upright, because they really don't have to rotate it that much to get the center of mass back over the pivot point.
Something that people don't talk about in these conversations about hysterical strength is that after a game, like a football game, let's say, this is so common, it's almost absurd. People just get wild and crazy, and they go and they flip cars over. These are presumably just people who are excited about the game, either loss or winning, and they're flipping cars over right and left. But it gets a lot of press when there's a person underneath the car and they flip it over or they lift it up. Same thing. That's working with gravity. So I think it's always been presented to me that this was a supernatural thing, and it's not a supernatural thing.
There's definitely very clear reasons why it wouldn't be supernatural. There's so many different possible ways that it's a prosaic explanation.
And as I said earlier, almost every single story I read had to do with lifting a car. All of them. There was the bear one. There was a couple others that were just not very interesting at all. But all the rest of them were, that I read, lifting a car.
So as for supernatural stuff, I truly don't know. Even like an exotic, like that maybe this is how it works explanation. I mean, like in the case of if physicalism isn't true, idealism is true, presumably a person could just think something and it would be more likely to happen or just happen. So it's really like, where's the most likely explanation? You have this huge range of possible, completely not supernatural, standard explanations, and they don't require much. In fact, they don't require anything extra in the universe. And then you have like, this tiny other side, which is require a huge amount, and they're just not very good explanations. Like, for instance, you're trying to lift the car off your kid and an alien spaceship comes over and you can't see it, it lifts it, and it looked like you did it. It's not very good explanation.
Okay, so if the car levitated on its own and no one was near it, there you go. That's supernatural.
Yeah.
If there were witnesses who saw the car levitate off.
So if it was like the person was running towards the car and you suddenly see like the weight being lifted off of it and the person crawls out, that would be more like, I don't have an explanation for that.
Right.
Maybe it was the wind. I don't know. But...
Or it was right teetering on the edge of
maybe like... But the big thing, though, is before you can even get to looking at possible exotic or prosaic explanations, you have to deal with that the person telling the story, the source of the story, or who is telling the story, who saw the events, they could be wrong about critical details.
Because hysterical or emergency, no, let me back up. Because adrenaline running high also affects your comprehension and memory.
Yeah, exactly. So they're really cool stories, and obviously they do like inspire things. So like the Hulk, that's really cool.
That is cool.
I mean, the Hulk is like a guy who drank a potion or something, and he gets mad and he gets really
really
but
strong.
you know, it's really interesting. I mean, it's an interesting phenomenon regardless if it's supernatural or not.
Yeah, but I think that there's an important thing to remember is that just because something can be explained doesn't make it any less fascinating or incredible.
Yeah.
And I think that it is fascinating and incredible that the human body is capable under duress to bend doors or lift cars or fight off frickin' polar bears. How bizarre is that? Our contact information is in the show notes. You can email us, text us, or even call and leave a 3-minute voicemail. And as always, if you have a story you want to tell, send it to us. Please share, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and never be so terrified you can't run.
You can't bend doors.